All right, so now let's talk about glasnost or openness. It really comes to the Far East belatedly, and it only found full expression completely in 1990 when many independent newspapers began to form throughout these cities and they begin to defy the government. And the thing that really drives this free speech, freedom of the press movement was the ecology of the Far East. And this is the wedge that scientists and journalists use to kind of sound the bell that people were starting to become aware of the harshness of what the Soviet government and the Soviet people had been doing to the environment. The Amur River was dying. Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk Sakhalin Island had the most polluted air in the country. There was radioactive fallout blanketing the Arctic, and Peter the Great Bay had been exposed to dangerous levels of radiation from military mishaps, not to mention the largest cat in the world, the Siberian tiger, was being hunted to extinction along with all types of other animals. They were being poached and so on and so forth. And so this is kind of the wedge that people use to start the free speech movement. And this consciousness really catalyzed resistance, and green groups organized Save the Amur movement. They blocked geothermal drilling on Kamchatka Island. Publicized peninsula. Sorry, they publicized location of atomic waste dumps, and they prevented port of calls of nuclear-powered submarines and ships. These giant nature-taming construction projects that we talked about to, bring the socialism and economy to the peoples fell into disrepute. And once the quote unquote project of the century in 1984, the Baikal Amur Railroad, was widely denounced as a monument to waste. And so what's happening is journalists switch from covering labor feats, right, in the Soviet Union. You talk about how great the Soviet worker is, to uncovering labor camps. It also Glasnost really also catches professionals and professors unawares. In 1990, 1991, you're still not quite sure who's going to win out. Um, so a lot of people remained on the side of the Soviet government and talked about ideological party lines. In Khabarovsk, for instance, some newspapers and professionals and professors continue to denounce the quote unquote class enemies and to exalt socialist construction in Kolyma, right, which is just a farce. Vladivostok, they continue to produce works talking about victory over American imperialists and Japanese militarists, right? They're not, there are a lot of people who are not going, still not sure if they should go against the Soviet government, or they don't want to. But in places like Magadan, for instance, Varlam Shalamov's very famous Kolyma Tales was published in a local journal, which unleashed a torrent of pent-up testimony from others. Sakhalin Island follows when local archivists and museum staff founded a history journal probing taboo topics like corruption in the party and the effects of Stalinization on the peoples. Um, However, this all-out anti-Stalin, anti-Soviet government rhetoric was also um, poked at a bit more gingerly in places like Khabarovsk, where a local journal asked in carefully chosen words whether forced collectivization had been an unmitigated blessing, basically saying, was Stalinization, was it that good, but not really saying Stalinization was bad, just kind of carefully questioning it. And like we talked about, It also brought out some business acumen from people, this openness. People began printing and publishing Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, which, if you ever have the chance, you should read Shalamov's Kolyma Tales. But the Gulag Archipelago is enormous, but it's just basically a blow-by-blow account of the gulags. Uh, People began selling tins that had likenesses of old Russian heroes that we discussed earlier in class, like men like Kvastov and Davidov, Muravyev, and we'll talk a little bit about him later. It's just this idea that these people who were pre-Soviet Russia are starting to come to the forefront, and people are starting to sell things dedicated to them to make money. Drawing on any way to make money in this new environment, in this openness. Drawing on another tradition, a journalist proposed that Russia's window on the Pacific develop a more Japanese-oriented sex industry. A trawler captain by the name of Amir Kizamutinov, that's a hard one to say, took over the presidency of what was called the Society for the Study of the Amur region. And to finance its struggle with the bureaucrats over downtown real estate, he leased some of the society's premises to a fast food restaurant. Right, basically, so you have these very serious meetings about how to save the Amur River and to fight bureaucrats, and in order to do that, you lease out your rooms to McDonald's, right? Which, hey, making money is making money. So what this showed is that a lot of people were just waiting to use some of their quote-unquote gifts, right, of being able to make money. But perhaps most importantly, what this does is this openness it prepares the way for the Far Easterners to come to terms with their past. So you get memorials of victims to Stalinism that arise everywhere in every city. In places like Chita, Chekists chivalrously offer to cover the costs. Right? Services were held to commemorate those who perished in the Kolyma gold fields, in the mini forests, and along the BAM route, the Baikal-Amur Railroad. Newspapers published rosters of local victims, and families began looking for lost relatives. They would at times find that NKVD cases, basically the military, the Interior Ministry police, kind of the KGB, would be the only place that they could actually find proof of a person's existence. But some of these are beginning to open up, and people are slowly but surely being allowed to look at these things. Compilers of an encyclopedia of the Far East set out to resurrect people, organizations, and a lot of other events that were consigned to the dust heap of ashes since the early 1920s. But this also did not stop people who were absolutely loyal to Lenin, Stalin, and the state. In fact, this is a statue of Lenin that was put up in the Siberian town of Surgut last year. It was put up one day, and then the day after it was put up, people had put red all over it, signifying blood. So even in 2016, there's still this movement of times were great during Stalin. Of course, hardly anybody's alive who remembers that, but still. People who had made their careers writing for the party or working for the party sometimes eked out their existence. Even with these new open revelations about disease, Arctic radiation, alcoholism, suicide, and death, all of these that were realities in communist society. A man by the name of Grigory Kodjur remained on the leading Far Eastern journal editorial board after he said that life for Amur natives under Stalin might not have been so luminous after all. So Grigory Kodjur is this literary. He's a writer and a poet who, for 20, 30 years, wrote about how great he wrote in a socialist realist type literature and poetry, right? How great the working man is, how great the Soviet government is, and so on and so forth. Lenin, Stalin, blah, blah, blah. But when the tide turns, he remains in power and a literary presence in the Far East, and all he has to do is say, well, maybe it wasn't that great. Um, Another man switched to his mother's ethnicity from Chukcha to Inuit, which allowed him to become a co-chair of the Siberian-Alaska Cultural Exchange, which was a highly lucrative job. Um, right, he had completely dis- disavowed being Inuit, but then when it worked in his favor, especially after the openness begins, then he changes and says, "Oh wait, by the way, I am Inuit, and I know that I am culturally and linguistically, ethnically connected to the Inuits of Alaska as well." So he becomes part of this large cultural exchange. Vladimir Songy, who was a veteran communist and part of the USSR Writers Union, very stalwart member of it, launched a new career as the founder of a NIFC autonomous republic on Sakhalin Island. Right, so he's changed, kind of used his power to remain in power, even though the tide was changing. But the average person during this transitional period was beset by the daily struggle to survive, like we talked about. So most neither had the time nor the desire to read and engage in such high intellectual pursuits. Coping with the present took much precedence over confronting the past. Um, and the complete overhaul of the economic system that was not based any longer on government subsidies hurt the intellectual and scientific communities as well, and those who could began to leave. Right, the Far East, without government help, the Far East becomes kind of this. Right, we talked about hospitals, universities, schools, journals. A lot of these things are closing or going away because there's just no money for them anymore. So if you were a doctor, if you're a lawyer, uh, if you're a professor, if you're a professional who was living off of state subsidies, you had to go somewhere else. It's what we call brain drain. When the smart leave their area in order to find better things. I believe it was I can't remember his name because I wasn't here, but the governor before Walker talked about that in Alaska, how we needed to make it so that people who live in Alaska don't want to leave and get their education elsewhere, because chances are most people tend to work near or close to where they go to college. Right, so it's the brain drain of Alaska. This is happening in the Far East as well. One director of Vladivostok University that was about to be closed left for Japan, and then he writes from Japan, "I recommend to everyone, whoever has the chance, leave. There will not be any science in this country for a long time." And so that's not a good outlook on life. It's not a good outlook on life, and it's not a good outlook for the future either. Right? These are things that people are dealing with. There's also a bit of social fragmentation during this time period. Uh, Grievances came from all angles as there's political uncertainty and economic woes that really do put strains, not only economically, but on ethnic and generational and even conjugal relationships. Marriages go down. People are having less kids. The population is going down drastically in these areas. Russia as a whole has a population problem, but the Far East is really high on that list. Transients from closed defense plants and labor camps helped Vladivostok become the national suicide and crime capital. where disputes literally could be ended with hand grenades. Um, so you have all of these state subsidized workers who no longer have jobs. They're going to move to the city, especially if they can't get out of the east. And then without jobs, crime goes up. Labor discipline also deteriorated as longshoremen, miners, teachers begin to acquire strike habits. And as consumer goods and other services were not making their way to the east, people would do things like hijack planes and Sakhalin and take whatever goods were in there. Others would block runways so that planes couldn't take off. In Magadan, and all of this was to demand better service and to get the goods that were on the planes. Um, riots ensued. Riots ensued in the town of Chita because alcohol was not making its way there. And there's also, we don't really have too much time to talk about it, or any at all. Social tensions were compounded by the defeat in Afghanistan and the downsizing of the military, which left many without jobs. And we know in Khabarovsk and on the eastern fringe, there's a lot of people in the military. So there's a lot of military men who are losing their jobs as well. The United States invaded Afghanistan. Excuse me, the USSR invaded Afghanistan. It's kind of their Vietnam, and it's kind of the beginning of the end. They tried to put in their own socialist government there, and they did not succeed. In fact, it was a complete disaster for them, and a lot of the people, the Mujahideen, who fought against the Soviet Union, including Osama bin Laden and Mullah Omar, were given money and help and weapons and helped caves dug by the CIA. And so the United States helped the Mujahideen defeat the Soviet Union and the Afghanistan war. And this war is very much seen as their Vietnam. Gorbachev will actually pull them out of the war, but by then the things were spiraling down quickly. There's a very good Russian movie by the name of Rota 9, which is Company 9. If you're ever interested, there's obviously subtitles. It's a really good movie about it's kind of like the Full Metal Jacket for the Afghanistan war, about the psychological and other damages that the war put on the military and the people of Afghanistan as well. One officer who lost his job was so mad that he hopped on a plane with a cluster bomb, and he was intending to throw it at Yeltsin, but he was caught way before he got there. And so you have this really big divide on how to deal with the wreckage of the end of communism. Some felt the moral wound of mass complicity would never heal. This idea that we all knew that Kolyma was a labor camp and we did nothing about it type of idea. Others insisted that those wounds did not exist. Some, as we have seen, begin to even more idealize the past, whether it was the Tsar or Stalin. Others even look back to the short-lived reign of Yuri Andropov. Andropov was the head of the KGB for a long time, and then he became the general secretary of the Soviet Union for about a year. That's why we didn't really talk about him. But his brief rule had one effect on no-frills vodka being available for cheap at the state stores. Your basic bathtub vodka was flowing heavily during Andropov's time. And people look back on that and said, man, remember that? Remember it was great when we could walk to the liquor store and buy vodka for pennies? And seasoned drinkers held that this type of vodka, which was introduced in 1983, was an acronym for Vot Ona Dobrota Komunista Andropov, right? That's VODKA. And in Russian, that means, here's the goodness of communist Andropov. Right, so things are getting so bad that people are even looking to things like, it was nice when vodka was cheap. Now vodka's not even cheap, right? And so you get this nostalgia for the past, which all societies tend to do. We do this about 1950s, 1960s, 1950s, right? When Peter Jennings writes, The Greatest Generation, things like that. Everybody has this nostalgia for the past. Um, However, national aspirations really assert themselves in the Far East, but not near as virulently as the Caucasus or Central Asia. And when I'm talking about national aspirations, I'm talking about the breakup of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev said, take as much autonomy as you can take, meaning that places like Georgia and Uzbekistan and Tajikistan were allowed to create their own republics, their own countries with their own government, not linked, quote unquote, completely to the Moscow government. So there are places in the Far East who are saying, we want our autonomy then too. One delegate to the Supreme Soviet wanted to make Azerbaijan, remember the Jewish autonomous oblast, genuinely Jewish, right? If we're going to if all of these people are getting their own independence, why can't we type of mentality? A national council of ethnic Koreans called for an autonomous enclave around Poziet. Descendants of Amur and Asuri Cossacks began to claim ancestral lands along the rivers, those rivers. Chukchi, Koryak, and Nanai activists formed the International League of Small Peoples and demanded that large tracts of the taiga be set aside exclusively for indigenous peoples. It's this movement like, this was our land way before the Soviet Union. We want it back. There were also Russians who were still 85% of the population, were also finding their roots. As capacity crowds began flocking back to Orthodox churches. Pre-revolutionary street names began to appear again. And remember Nikolai Muravyev from way back and his expeditions along the Amur, and then he became governor general. His ashes were brought from Paris to Vladivostok and buried with pomp, along with an original statue that was recast on its original pedestal, and it overlooked the Amur and Khabarovsk. Rehabilitation for Russian white leaders in the Civil War occurred as well. In Irkutsk, people began to take up money for a statue to Admiral Kolchak. Remember him? He was the main hero and leader for the whites in the eastern section during the Civil War. And so there are many other examples of people trying to bring back a less harsh past, but also trying to move forward and creating their own independence and their own autonomy based on ethnic lines, cultural lines, and actual geography. Right? It's Gorbachev said, take as much autonomy as you can take. And peoples in the Far East, just like people in the Caucasus and Central Asia, took that to mean we want our own land then and our own government. So the question that we'll end with is this today, or this week, is the idea of regionalism or localism. All authorities from the bottom up vied between and amongst themselves on how to shape the Far East. And so for the first time since the 1920s, one could openly talk about regional interests diverging from the center. It became fashionable to fault Moscow for pocketing revenue meant for the East, which would then stunt Moscow's growth, which would then stunt the Eastern's growth, and for making relations with their neighbors tense, like Yeltsin overskipping everybody to deal with Japan and talk about giving some of the Kuril Islands back, or South Sakhalin back, to the Japanese for economic development, and so on and so forth. It also became thought of as colonial in nature, and there was a feeling of betrayal, but there was also this kind of newfound feeling of individualism as well. For instance, people in Magadan bristled when Moscow wanted to be part of a memorial to Stalin's victims. Right? The new government under Yeltsin says, well, we want to be a part of that. And they're like, that's okay. It's our memorial, not yours. Kamchatkans protested when they were told that the marijuana, the diamonds, the gold, and the hard currency that was coming from there and being built up by private enterprise would be confiscated and turned over to the central authorities. They said, no, that's not yours, it's ours. But when it came down to it, people in the East also showed little readiness to relinquish the perks of dependence, food and fuel deliveries, and other subsidies from the center. Right. This is a place that had been so dependent on the central government for so long that just taking away all of those things is not going to help them, because they don't know how to run on their own. They just don't. So in practice, the idea of regional autonomy served as a multi-purpose political instrument. When in 1991, after Gorbachev resigns, when Yeltsin says he wanted a quick solution to that question, the question of regional autonomy, people like Governor Fyodorov, sensing that places like Sakhalin would be squeezed out of the deal, declared that the Far East should form a separate republic, especially if Moscow continued to barter away Eastern resources and trade with other countries, right? So there's this feeling in the East that all of these great natural resources that are being sucked out of the ground and out of the sea, all of the goods that were located there, the people making money off of it was the government all the way back in Moscow, not Far Easterners. And politicians throughout would use that same threat in order to get more allocations from the center treasury, or to acquire a greater say in economic decisions and to upgrade the region's status within the Russian Federation. So there was always this kind of underlying threat from people in the Far East. Well, we'll just create our own republic and separate from the Russian Federation, and then we'll be the ones who get all the revenue from oil and fish and timber and so on, and gold and so on and so forth. But theatrics notwithstanding, they were facing formidable obstacles from above and below. Moscow continued to lease fishing rights to foreigners and collect most of the hard currency that was earned through that. While Yeltsin was promising parliament leaders more autonomy for his support, in the backroom deals he was squeezing the Far East. And he was backed by most military and security organs in the region who did not want to regionalize. They wanted to keep their jobs, and their employer was the state, so they're going to back the state. You also had localism that began to show as more local leaders did not listen or follow instructions from the center, and they began making their own way, which also meant that there were local fights for power as well. Khabarovsk and Vladivostok kind of were the two big cities there, and they're close to each other, and they're fighting for resources and tax revenue. The Jewish Autonomous District declared its autonomy from Khabarovsk. And even within Vladivostok, there were two main political groups vying for rival plans for long-term development. One was more Moscow-centered, one was more Far Eastern-centered. And so at the grassroots level, talk of regional autonomy really did go beyond theatrics. Some communities felt impelled to look after their own interests rather than wait for metropolitan or district bureaucrats to act on their behalf. So, for example, having suffered years of neglect while watching their marine sources exploited for the benefit of outsiders, Kuril Islanders grew suspicious of bureaucrats in general and began monitoring presidential, parliamentary, and even gubernatorial maneuvers for improprieties. Basically, Kuril Islanders were holding their politicians accountable and began um, refusing to send their resources to Moscow. And it's not just Kuril Islanders versus this Moscow either, or St. Petersburg. It's Kuril Islanders versus Vladivostok, right? Versus Khabarovsk, versus Sakhalin Island, right? You get this really once you get this thought, this mindset that you're all no longer Soviet communists, that you're actually people, then you begin to really think of yourselves as far as I'm from Kuril Islands. I'm no longer a Soviet. I'm a Kuril Islander. I'm not from Sakhalin. I'm not from Kamchatka. I'm not from Yakutsk. I'm not from Vladivostok. I'm from the Kuril Islands. Um, but we'll end with this. The bottom line was the habit of dependence was hard to kick. When Moscow indicated that it would send only prepaid fuel to the Kurils, for instance, a county official requested and received a loan from Japan. Okay, so if you don't depend on the Soviets, then you have to depend on the Japanese, right? There's just this ingrained feeling of dependence. And so that is where we will end next week. So you have all of these questions that need to be answered after the breakup of the Soviet Union. How do we move from this complete feeling of center not only subsidizing, but just being absolutely dependent on the central government into this place that has all of these natural resources that can be used, but also these natural resources, much of the revenue is still going back to people in the West. And so there's this real question of how do we change that? How do we fix that? How do we get out of this habit of dependence? And people were questioning that, and no one really knew. And so next week we're going to just discuss about the Far East moving forward, and after a bit more about right after the fall of Russia or the Soviet Union, and we're going to talk about whether it's an outpost or a window to the world and to Russia. And we'll also deal with some of the environmental issues that are dealt with today, and then our class will be over. So that is your PowerPoint for the week. Please let me know if you have any questions.